Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Pamela Cook is the author of 4 rural fiction titles published by Hachette between 2012 and 2016. Titles which Pamela herself describes as fiction about feisty women, tangled family relationships and a healthy dose of romance. A passionate advocate for promoting and celebrating women's voices through media, literature, publishing and in life, Pamela co-hosts The Rights for Women and The Rights for Festival podcasts. A former English teacher, Pamela also teaches creative writing and has facilitated many courses through her business Just Right Publishing. But 3 years on from her last book, Pamela is about to release her 5th novel. This time she's going it alone, plunging headfirst into the world of self-publishing. The new novel, called Cross My Heart, is a beautiful story that had me enchanted from start to finish. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Pamela to the podcast today. Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Claudine. Thanks so much for having me on.
It's my absolute pleasure. Pamela, I'd like to start by asking you to tell me a little bit about your inspiration behind this novel.
That's a really interesting question, actually, because it's one of those stories that came together quite slowly. And, I've been thinking to myself for a while now, where did the actual seed of the idea come from? And it's been really hard to pinpoint. But I guess for all writers, there's that what if type, scenario that happens. And I think going back sort of into my childhood, there was a situation where I was in as a child, quite a young child, where there was a local guy who was he was a creep, put it that way. And there was sort of all this mystique around him about what he'd done and, that he'd attacked women and, all this sort of stuff. And I remember as we grew up, so I lived in a suburb in the south of Sydney, and I remember that as we grew up, this guy was always around, and he lived next door to the local park. And I'd had a bit of a scary incident with him myself. Nothing happened, but that I was just frightened by his presence type thing when I was quite small. And then I wanted to write a story about friends who had not fallen out, but just drifted, but still had a very strong connection. I think it's one of those stories that little bits of things that have happened in my life over time have sort of come together, but then have gone off in a complete tangent, if you know what I mean. And there's a couple of other things in the story, some elements in the story. So there's some equine assisted learning, which some people will know as equine therapy, although they are 2 different things. That's in the story as well. And that's something that I'd read about a lot when I actually wrote Blackwattle Lake, my first novel, that horses were used as sort of therapy and to help people who'd suffered PTSD in the Black Saturday bushfires. And that was something that really stuck in my mind too, and just was something I always wanted to explore and write about. And I don't know, it was just, this book is one of those stories where a whole lot of things came together from different places and just ended up, in the melting pot.
Well, it's a fascinating read, and I've been very fortunate to have read it already. But for those who haven't read it, can you tell us about the story?
Yeah, so it's a story about a woman who becomes foster mother to her very long-term friend's child when her friend dies. And the two women haven't actually seen each other for quite some time, but Tess, the main character, had made this promise to her friend that if anything ever happened to her, she would, take on her daughter. So her friend was a single mother, and the daughter at the time the story opens is 10, but Tess hasn't actually seen her since she was sort of a preschooler, and so doesn't really have a relationship with her. She's also in a marriage which they've sort of made an agreement that they weren't going to have children. She lives in the city. She's a bit of a high flyer. She owns her own human resources consultancy. And, so the story sort of goes from there, and it's about her having to confront an issue from her past that had to do with her friend who has passed away. So not being back in her house from her childhood, but going to the friend's house, taking, the friend's daughter, Grace, there, and then forming this relationship with Grace brings up a lot of this stuff that she's sort of blocked out or hasn't wanted to deal with from her past. And then, the story goes from there. So it's about her relationship with Grace and the two of them getting to know each other and seeing if they can form that sort of mother-daughter relationship. But it's also about her friendship and this issue from her past that she now has to confront.
I think it's fair to say that this book marks a shift in genre from rural fiction with romantic elements to a contemporary women's fiction novel. Was there a reason for this shift, or was it more about the story that you wanted to tell?
Yeah, look, it's more about the story that I wanted to tell. I guess in some ways, it's funny when I think back to my very first book, Blackwattle Lake, which set me on the path of writing rural fiction with romantic elements, because I would never say that my books are really straight rural romance, mainly because the stories are always more about an issue in the woman's life that isn't necessarily the romance, but there has been a romantic thread going through the stories. So when I think back to Blackwattle Lake, it's probably the most similar to this one in that it didn't really have a romance as such in it. And I think because I've always been interested in writing about women's lives and exploring the relationships that women have, and some of those relationships are going to be romantic relationships, but there's a whole lot of other relationships for women, obviously, that, I'm quite interested in exploring. And I guess for this particular story, it's the romance isn't necessarily a part of that. There's a whole lot of other stuff that the character has to deal with. For me, it's almost like a love story between Tess and Grace, who she comes to know and to form that relationship, sort of mother-daughter relationship with. So it was more just it wasn't like me sort of saying, oh, I don't want to write that anymore. It was more about the story and where that story took me, in terms of where the emphasis was, I guess.
I wanted to delve a little into Tessa's character for a moment. And as you mentioned, she's the protagonist of this novel, and she labours under a great deal of guilt for most of the story. And without giving away any spoilers, I think she spends a whole lot of her life wondering if she's done the right thing by keeping this terrible secret. And it turns her into a different person. It takes a tragedy to help her understand how that guilt has led her to live a kind of half-life, if you will. How did you tap into that emotion?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you've come up with that description of her character, because it's exactly what I wanted to portray. Look, I'm really interested in the psychology in our characters, why we end up being the way we are, how different events in our lives affect us, how they might, as you say, sort of tamp down certain aspects of our personality or lead us to make choices that we might not otherwise have made had a particular thing not happened to us. So I'm really interested in that in terms of people. And it's something that when I start writing a story, like I'm not we probably all know the old plotter and pantser thing. I'm not much of a plotter. I don't really do detailed outlines, but I do always at some point, once I've started the story and start to get to know the character, I do sort of stop and really go quite deeply into a character's psyche and think, where, particularly with Tess, I've done this, if this particular thing happened, and as you say, no spoilers, but how would that affect her future relationships? How would it affect her relationships with her close family, like her mother, for instance? So I sort of go into a little bit on her own relationship with her mother too. And, her siblings, and she's the youngest of three, and she's from a family where she's sort of been the princess and but had a bit of a breakout when she, was in her teens and things like that. So I'm just always really interested in finding out and developing how characters come to be who they are, and then putting them into a situation where there is some sort of pressure that they're under and some sort of turning point where they then have to really think about, who they really are and who they have maybe been pretending to be. So there's that little bit of an idea of those masks that we wear too, and having those stripped away at some point.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating and something I really enjoy exploring in my own writing as well. So taking on the responsibility of caring for another person's child is huge. But in this case, do you think that Tessa's courage and determination to foster Grace is a product of her guilt or her innate loyalty? I mean, there's no doubt that she's a decent person, but she's grossly unprepared to parent a grieving 10-year-old child, isn't she?
Yeah, definitely. And she has a lot of resistance from her husband for that very reason, and from her mother. Because she is quite a part of quite a close family unit. I think it is a combination, and it was interesting because when I was working on the edits, one of the things that I discussed with the editor was changing the age of Tess when certain things happened back in her childhood, and changing the way she remembered it. But for me, a big part of her motivation in taking Grace on initially is guilt. For her, it is both loyalty because, I guess we've all got those friends. You still feel a very close connection to them, even though you haven't seen them for a long time. So, to hear that person has gone and that you will never see them again is really disturbing because apart from your grief, it's that there is that guilt, like, why didn't I go and see them more? Why didn't, I keep in contact? So there's sort of guilt on that level as well. And then burrowing down, of course, into that further is the actual love that she had for this friend, and the genuine friendship that, she then starts to remember as the story goes on.
Moving on to Grace for a moment, there are many examples in literature of the way in which childhood trauma can rob a child of their voice, both metaphorically and physically. But I thought it was interesting the way your novel views it from an adult's perspective. Tessa doesn't know how to deal with it, and she's feeling quite out of her depth, but sensitive to the circumstances giving rise to Grace's withdrawal. Her mother and husband, however, are almost callous in their disregard for what Gracie has gone through, aren't they?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to have that contrast in a way because Tessa's husband is quite a driven career type sort of guy. They have made this a bit of a pact, I guess, when they became engaged and then married that, children weren't for them. And Tess had reasons at the time why she thought, why she felt that it was okay to agree to that. He sees Grace as being basically an interruption, I guess, an annoyance to their life in a way. He does sort of try initially, I think, to sort of go along, if you like. That's probably as far as he goes, is to go along, but with the whole idea. And then Tessa's mother herself is sort of her big issue with Tess is that she's sort of in her mid-30s and has never had a child, and she desperately wants her to have the mother wants her to have a child. But this isn't when this 10-year-old sort of potentially disturbed, grief-stricken child turns up. It's not the way that Tessa's mother envisioned that happening.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a bit of it's a challenge to the mother's notion of her perfect family. She's got this sort of idea of how she wants her own children, and it's that idea too and I guess I'm finding this out as the mother of adult children.
Yeah.
Is how much can you push your own ideas and your wishes and your suggestions onto your adult children too, and at what point do you then allow them to just make their own way and make their own decisions without sort of judgment and direction? So I was I don't go into great depth on that particular relationship, but there is that idea that, Tessa's mother isn't very happy with this situation, and she does probably not come across very sympathetic towards Gracie's situation, because she's so obsessed with this whole issue with her own daughter. She can't really see beyond that, how it's going to impact her and how it's impacting their extended family.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a selfish thing there, I think, going on too. Yeah, but that's always interesting to explore and see how that changes or doesn't change during the course of the story.
You spoke a little bit before about the equine-assisted therapy that Grace undertakes in order to deal with her trauma. And I wanted to ask you, what kind of research did you do to delve into, obviously that as a treatment method?
Yeah, so as I said, it's something that we have horses in my family. We have way too many horses. And I didn't come to know anything about horses until I was in my 40s myself and well into adulthood. But they're they're amazing animals and they're extremely intuitive. And I had read this article, a number of articles actually, after the Black Saturday bushfires about using horses for people who have suffered from some sort of trauma, because they can. I remember reading in that first article actually about that they can actually pick up your heartbeat from some distance away. So they don't ask me how all this works. I'm not that up on it, but yeah, they can. So the whole idea is that in focusing on working with the horse, well, one thing is that you have to be completely focused on what you're doing. So it's in that way, it's a sort of a form of mindfulness, I guess, in working with the horse. It's also a way of, a lot of people, there's a lot of fear around horses too, and so they're big animals and they can be unpredictable. You never quite know what they're going to do. But sort of being drawn into this one-on-one type relationship with them and just really, I guess, trying to get your mind to commune almost with their mind. I mean, it sounds a little bit do-do-do-do, but I started to sort of research it a few years ago, and I went to one sort of day where I just was with a practitioner, and then I've read a whole lot on it. And then I went to another day up at Dungog at a place called Horse Sanity, where we had this whole day with the horses, and they were beautiful Frisian horses. And it was really interesting because I'd gone there with the intention of just research. I'm here to research my book. But as soon as we sort of sat down and started talking, I'd been through a situation which also informs this book, in that my best friend passed away a few years ago. So I was sort of in a situation where I was grieving. And even though I hadn't gone to this session for that, it's amazing how all those emotions just came up as part of the interaction with the horses. It was this amazing sort of sense of being in a safe place where you could unburden all your emotions and sort of really start to think about how you're feeling. So that was a really amazing experience. And since then so I started to incorporate that into the story, because I wanted to use a form of, and I have learned that there are two different types of, so there's equine therapy, which is a much more, I guess, formal psychology-based way of doing things. And then there's equine assisted learning, which I guess if you're thinking in terms of standards, it would be like doing a degree as opposed to doing a diploma. It's so the equine assisted learning hasn't got as strong a psychological depth, if you like, as the equine therapy has, but they work along the same lines, and it is being used quite a lot with veterans to deal with PTSD and things like that. So and there are places where they take where people who have suffered from, say, domestic violence or abuse, and kids of certain ages, go and work with horses with the help of these practitioners who are very well versed in sort of running, the training session. So it was a really fascinating thing to do, and I do plan to do more of it down the track, like just as a, going along, not as teaching it. But yeah, and it was just something I wanted to incorporate into the story, because I do love, I've still got in this book the rural setting. The horses aren't a huge feature, but this is a way that I thought I could incorporate them into the story. And I thought it was an interesting form of sort of counselling, if you like, to use for Grace, and becomes something that Tess also surprisingly finds helpful.
There's been many notable examples, certainly in recent Australian literature, books like Holly Ringland's Lost Flowers of Alice Hart and Tabitha Bird's A Lifetime of Impossible Days, both of which demonstrate a need to find a creative outlet for trauma through writing, storytelling or art. And this is no less true of Sky in your book. And I wanted to ask you, do you think there's more to that than simple expression, in the sense that maybe there is an inability to speak about trauma openly, but it's far easier to say in words on a page or strokes of paint on a canvas?
Yeah, I do. I really do. So Sky is Tessa's friend who has passed away in the story, and she's always, even when they were at school together, was a very gifted artist. but because of circumstances, never had the opportunity to really do much with that talent. And what Tess discovers is that, she had actually continued to paint and to work on her art in that time that they hadn't seen each other. And I do think that having some sort of creative outlet, I know myself with my writing, and, I've done different forms of writing over the years, from poetry, journaling on and off, and there was a period where I did quite a lot of journaling and what's called morning pages, where you sort of spill all your words onto the page when you get up in the morning, and it's like a cathartic sort of, blurting everything out in any order. And you might never ever use it for any sort of formal writing, but it's a way of just managing your thoughts and, I guess, it's like getting things off your chest, or getting them out of your brain. Yeah. So, I really think that any form of art, and that any form of that creative work where you become very connected to yourself, to your subconscious, I find it very, very therapeutic, and it can bring up difficult things that you might then have to deal with. Because I know, in my work as a writing teacher, sometimes when I've been in classes or courses and you read people's work and you think, yeah, this is really good, but you sort of get the sense that people are just scratching the surface of an emotion. And sometimes if you sort of say to them, oh, yeah, it'd be good if you could go, and they'll say, oh, no, I can't go any deeper than that. It's too confronting. Yeah. And while I get that on the one hand, sometimes I think, it might be confronting in the short term, but sometimes actually going into that is a really good way of then dealing with whatever it is. So I think, things like journaling, art, writing, sculpting, anything creative, I think is a fabulous outlet, not just for ideas, but for emotions and experiences as well.
Now, we were both attendees at the recent RWA conference down in Melbourne, where there was some discussion about the advisability or importance of having trigger warnings in books dealing with difficult themes and subject matters. What do you think about this? I mean, do we as writers have a duty to warn people about potentially upsetting subject matter?
It's a really good question. It's one I've been grappling with, and had, like you, at the conference on the weekend, I was in discussions with people about this after that session. I haven't put a trigger warning in this book, even though I potentially could have. I have put information at the back of the book for anybody who might feel the need to, if it's brought up any experience for anyone that they then need to talk about. For me, it's almost like anything can trigger an episode or an emotion or experience. Like you could walk down the street and see something in a shop window that could be triggering, or something could come on television. Like not everything that comes on our TV screens has a trigger warning in front of it. Some things that are really, 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 I guess, confronting do. But it's actually a question I'm still grappling with. So there's the issue for me is I haven't put one in this book. At this point, I don't feel the need for everything to have a trigger warning, but that's not to say that down the track I might change my mind about that.
Yeah, look, I don't necessarily believe we need to have trigger warnings and everything, but it's an interesting perspective, whether we do or we don't. I mean, just as an example, I read a book recently that from the cover and from everything I'd heard about the book, gave me no indication of what was going to be inside it, namely snakes.
I think I know the book you mean.
Yeah. So the book dealt very vividly with snakes, and there were quite a few really confronting scenes for me. Having said that, it didn't lessen my enjoyment of the book in any way, shape or form. I thought the book was fabulous. But it was interesting because then I went on to Goodreads later and saw that a number of people had said, this book should come with a trigger warning. I wonder what our duty as writers.
Yeah, I do wonder too, and I did, as you mentioned, Holly Ringland's gorgeous book, The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart, which I absolutely loved. And, when I was grappling with this myself, do I put a trigger warning in? I had a look to see what Holly had done, and she'd put the thing at the end, as I have now, chosen to do. And the other thing, I guess, too, from from an author's point of view in a story, like, if it's the book I'm thinking of that you're referring to with the snakes, if you put a trigger warning and mention the word snake at the beginning of that, well, it might turn off readers, yeah, but it also gives away a fair chunk of the plot, like a really important plot point.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. It's something I'm still, I guess, struggling with around that whole issue, and for the next book, if there was anything that came up, I may change my mind about that, and I might have a trigger warning in it, or we'll see what happens. Yeah,
it's just a really interesting point to a discussion point that came up at the conference in the weekend, and my mind immediately flew to that book that I'm talking about, and I wish to make it absolutely 100% clear that I loved that book, and it didn't lessen my enjoyment of the book in any way, shape or form, but it was just an interesting thought that I had following the book. So changing direction a little bit, I wanted to chat more to you about your decision to self-publish this novel. Take me through the jump from traditional to self-publisher and the differences.
Yeah, well, there's huge differences I've discovered this year, mainly in terms of how much control you have, but I'll come back to that. So I have had 4 books published with Hachette, and it's been a fantastic experience, and I have learnt a lot, and I've met some wonderful people, and it just so happened that this particular story, when I gave it to my publisher, was something they were not really, it wasn't for them, basically. By the time I'd written the book, it was, as I said, it'll be 3 years in December since I've had a book out, and I wanted to sort of get moving on it. Once I'd decided that I'd, had finished it and edited it and whatever, I wanted to then get it out fairly quickly. It's very hard to sort of know, I could send it off to a lot of publishers and find out, they did or didn't want it, but it's a very long process. The publishing wheels will move very slowly. And because it was moving into a different genre in a way, sort of going into the more women's fiction, I just thought, you know what, I've spoken to a lot of people who have done it, and I've got friends who have published their own books, and they actually really loved the control and the ability to, for instance, choose your cover and choose your editor and work with the editor in the way that you choose to, which they're all things that I've really loved about this process. And to be honest, unless you're an absolute mega, selling author, you have to do a lot of your own promotion anyway. You do a lot of sort of social media promotion. A lot of the things I've ever appeared at in terms of festivals and things like that, I have organised myself. So I sort of felt like I was doing a lot of that anyway. I'm just giving it a shot and seeing how it goes. And who knows, next book, what I'll do, I'm just going to see how this whole process goes. But I have really enjoyed it, and I've had amazing support from fellow writers who have really helped me sort of, they've been beta readers for me, giving me feedback, giving me suggestions about editorial, who to go to, what to do. And I'm, using a consultant to help me put it all together, because it is a very, it's a really different process. Like I think when you're traditionally published, pretty much the last time you have to read the book, because you do get really sick of reading it over and over and over, is after the proofread. But then, of course, there's all this stuff that happens after that, like the typesetting and the formatting and the getting it into the right format for uploading to various platforms for the digital books. And so, there's a lot more checking and everything that I'd even realised. So that's what I've been doing, and it's a big learning curve, but it's been really interesting. And I'm just going to see how it goes, and I'm not sort of planning too far ahead. I'm just going to see what happens with this one.
You were part of the organising committee that brought the fantastic and hugely successful Storyfest Writing Festival to life on the South Coast in June of this year. As an attendee, I was bowled over by the quality of the authors in attendance, the panel discussions and the gala events. And what I thought particularly good was that it had a largely commercial fiction focus rather than just the literary. The authors and books were those most people like to read, Australian authors that festival goers knew and loved. So I wanted to know, what has the feedback been from an organisational point of view?
Oh, we've had amazing feedback, and I'm really glad you enjoyed it. And thank you for those lovely words. It was a huge event to organise, and Milton is sort of the place where my heart is. I guess I don't live there full time, but I love the south coast of New South Wales. So I was really happy to be asked to be part of that. And we set out from the very beginning to make it. We wanted it to be a bit different to some of the other, even the regional festivals, which some of them have actually become very similar to Sydney Writers' Festival, which is wonderful and we love it, but a very strong literary emphasis. And as you say, not so much emphasis on commercial fiction. And we wanted to be able to have books like that people know and love and really want to meet the authors. And a lot of those books and authors have a great following, and, they're very sort of great on social media and things like that. So that was sort of our goal, really, was to make it very accessible and to provide, I guess, a platform for Australian authors in particular to really come and talk about, what they're writing about. But we have had fantastic feedback. It's really funny, actually. I think this week is probably the week when we've actually started, after about 8 weeks, communicating with each other on the committee. It was such an intense experience, and organising something like that from scratch. Even though we all it was good. We had a really good combination of different skills to bring to the party. But I think we were all so exhausted that we've just sort of laid very low since then, and we're getting together the next week to start thinking about the next one.
So you've built a veritable community of like-minded women writers around you through your writing, your teaching, and also your podcasting. How important is it to you in terms of your writing and journey?
Oh, hugely important. Yeah, I've been in a writers group for probably about well over 10 years now, probably going on for about 14 years. And the women, there have been women in that group, have been so supportive. And, like for all of us, I think, as you know, Claudine, that the writing life has a lot of ups and downs. Like you can finish a book and think it's the best thing ever. And then, you can send it off to a publisher and get it rejected. And then it's like you're never going to write again. And so there's and then you can, be lucky enough to get a publishing contract or decide to self-publish, whatever you do. But along the way, there's lots of ups and downs. And I think without having that support of those particular people in my writing group, I probably would have given up at some point. And I also like to, because I've been a teacher, I think, in my background too, I still have that love of teaching, even though I'm really glad I'm not in a high school classroom anymore. But I love to see people switching on to the joy of writing. Like you'll be in a room or a workshop or something with people, and you just sort of can see, we talk about those light bulb moments, and you can see when those sort of flick on for people, and just seeing people enjoy writing for the love of it, and a little bit like what we were talking before about that creative expression, and just like you say, like-minded people coming together because of their love of writing, their love of books, their love of the written word. And, I think I was someone that from a very young age, I grew up in a household filled with books. My father was a book collector, and I just always was surrounded by them, So then I went into English teaching initially as a profession, but I've always had that love of writing as well. So to be in a community where I'm able to sort of talk, non-stop about books, writing, and all those issues around it, it's really fulfilling. And, it's not something that I'm not a multi-millionaire from it by any means, but certainly in terms of experiences and connections. And for me, writing is very much about connection. So to be able to connect to other people through writing is fantastic. It's just the best kind of life. I love it.
I have a lot of aspiring or emerging writers who listen to this podcast. And given your experience as both a writer and a teacher, what would you say are the most common mistakes emerging or aspiring writers make?
The first thing that comes to mind is sending your work off to a publisher too early, or to an agent or a publisher. Or not, even more than that, is actually giving it to anyone else too early, and possibly giving it to the wrong people. So be very wary of who you show your words to. Initially, I would say write for yourself and get really comfortable with your voice and get lots of different writing experience. I'm a great subscriber of going to writing courses. Like I think there's always more to learn. And I have a huge collection of how to write type books. So I think, I think, yes, definitely follow your own instinct and your own intuition, but also learn along the way. Like you can always learn craft. And, yeah, I would find some trusted writer friends, because sometimes when you show your work to a family member or a friend who doesn't write, for the first thing, they don't really get how hard it is to actually show anyone your words initially. And they might not give you the feedback that you need. So they'll either tell you, wow, that's fantastic, when it actually needs a fair bit of work before you do anything with it.
Yeah.
Or they might make just one little comment that to them is harmless, but it could send you into this whole spiral of, oh God, they hate it, it's terrible, I'm never going to write again. So you just need to be really wary about who you show it to, at what stage you show it to. And I would say to build up lots of resilience and lots of courage by entering sort of smaller competitions with maybe short pieces of writing, if you like, to start with. And certainly be very aware that no matter who you are or how long you've been writing for or what you've written, rejection is a big part of the process. Yeah. So you always have to be prepared for it, but then you have to be able to then pick yourself up and say, well, that's too bad because I really love writing, so I'm going to use that rejection or whatever comment it was to actually improve my writing and to see how I can make it better.
So I wanted to ask you, if listeners wanted to connect with you, how could they do that?
So I have a website, pamelacook.com.au, which is just about to be relaunched, hopefully, in the next week or two with a bit of an updated look. The new book's coming out. I'm on Instagram, Pamela Cook Writes on Instagram, and I've got 3 different things. It's ridiculous, but on Twitter I'm Pamela Cook AU, capital AU. So, and I'm on Facebook, Pamela Cook Author.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, I'd love to, connect. And I'm always happy if people want to flip me questions. If you ever have any questions about writing or whatever, not that I'm a total expert, but, I've been doing it for a while and teaching it for a while. So I'm always happy to chat to authors about their work.
I wanted to say it's been such a joy and an honour for me to chat to you today. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Oh, it's been lovely to be on, Claudine. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, listeners, for your chance to win a copy of Pamela's beautiful new book, head over to my Instagram account or Facebook page and follow the prompts to win. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.